I've been on the
How can I give back to sport and sport in Australia? It's a massive part of my life, but a massive part of Australian culture.
Hopefully the experience that I have and the perspective that I bring from a gymnastics background can help shape things in a way that helps move the sport in the right direction.
People like myself and Ellie Cole and other elite para-athletes are sitting on these committees and these advisory groups because we need to have more of a voice to represent those athletes with disabilities.
There needs to be more collaboration between policy and strategy and the coalface of sport, the people who are actually doing it and who it's impacting.
Sports integrity is getting involved. They're building a framework around member protection, child safety, and I think if we keep moving in that direction, we'll sort of see a sport that's a lot healthier, happier, and athletes with the longevity that we want.
It's evolving very, very fast, and some of the integrity issues that we face are very different to what the able-bodied community face.
Welcome to Onside, the official podcast of Sport Integrity Australia. Our mission is to protect the integrity of sport and the health and welfare of those who participate in Australian sport.
Hello and welcome to Sport Integrity Australia's podcast Onside. I'm Tim Gavel. Well, there are a number of new faces on Sport Integrity Australia's Athlete Advisory Group. The advisory group offers strategic guidance to Sport Integrity Australia from an athlete's perspective. 2012 Olympic rower Bronwen Downie is the chair of the group, and we'll be speaking to Bronwen in just a moment, along with fellow Athlete Advisory Group members, dual Olympian in the sport of trampolining Blake Gaudry and vision-impaired Paralympic triathlete Jonathan Goerlach. Well, firstly to you, Bronwen, what prompted you to take on a role with the Athlete Advisory Group?
That is actually a bigger question than you might think, Tim, because there's a lot of reasons. Sport was such an enormous and wonderful part of my life and continues to be so. And so one of the big driving factors was, as corny as it might sound, how can I give back to sport and sport in Australia? It's a massive part of my life, but a massive part of Australian culture. And wanting to be part of the solution that allows young people to get in sport and stay in sport. And there are lots of threats to that, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. So that was one of the driving factors. The other is that as an elite athlete, I guess you develop a persona and you develop a view of the world that normalises stuff being really, really hard. Being an elite athlete can be really hard, and sometimes I think athlete wellbeing is overlooked in that particular system because athlete voice is not always at the forefront, doesn't need to be right at the front, but, it can be hard to speak up as an athlete about stuff that you're not comfortable with or things that are happening. And I think it's really important that we can create some pathways to hear that athlete voice when it's in relation to athlete wellbeing. And I saw my position on the Sport Integrity Australia Athlete Advisory Group as a way to help support that actually happening.
Things have changed though. There has been almost a revolution with the athlete voice now becoming very prominent in a lot of discussion around, how do we take care of people going forward? What do we need in sport in terms of governance? A lot of it is about the athlete voice.
It is, and I think that is a reflection of people's recognition that there needs to be more collaboration between policy and strategy and the coalface of sport, the people who are actually doing it and who it's impacting. Because we can have all the policies and structures in place to help that, but the lived experience, interpersonal relationships that are happening between athletes, coaches, their national sporting organisations is where there has to be conversations, and we have to be able to hear those to understand what's actually happening in sports training centres, on sports fields, and so that's where I think athlete voice is growing, and it's really great to see that is being supported through people like Sport Integrity Australia.
You've only been on the Athlete Advisory Group a pretty short time, relatively speaking. But have you been surprised by some of the things you've found out that you probably didn't know heading into this particular group?
I have indeed. I think the width and breadth of what Sport Integrity Australia are responsible for was a big surprise. There's just such an enormous amount of work that is being done and needs to be done around protecting sport and threats to sport. So I think it's going to be a big learning curve in this position, and as well as an fantastic opportunity for people like myself and other athletes on the advisory group to be of assistance and to have an impact and to use our knowledge and experiences in sport to help support the work of Sport Integrity Australia.
Have you got an example of something you thought, gee, I thought it was nothing to do with that, or is it something to do with this? Or is there something that is a specific example?
Oh, I've got a lot, and as you say, it's sort of I'm new to the position, so learning on the job. I didn't realise that Sport Integrity Australia had interest and oversight in things like match fixing and gaming, which is a whole arm. I was obviously aware of their involvement in drug offences, being formerly ASADA, and their involvement in now what they're trying to do with the National Integrity Framework is just such an enormous piece of work that I think can fundamentally change how that athlete voice is supported through the reporting processes and having a place where athletes feel very comfortable, or anyone in sport for that matter, reporting integrity matters to a kind of a neutral body. And that the scope of that is so large. Yeah.
Also with this is Blake Gaudry, and Blake, a champion trampolinist. I guess you're coming into this from a sport that I guess hasn't got the profile of some of the other sports that are involved. Do you have to explain what your sport is about as well as, I guess, telling people about the examples that you might have from your sport?
Yeah, unfortunately, trampolining in Australia is not as high profile as a lot of other sports, but, over the years, people are starting to, get more involved. It only went into the Olympic Games in 2000, so it's relatively fresh and new within the sporting community. But when I'm explaining it to people, they always ask, how'd you get into it? Started in the backyard on the trampoline like everyone else. And it's much similar to diving, but instead of, going one way, we have to go back up again, stay on our feet. So, it's pretty easy to grasp once you learn, you have a look and come enjoy. Sometimes if you go to bounce, you can see people bouncing around and having fun. It's pretty straightforward. But in terms of my experiences in trampolining, we've sort of been involved in a sport that's had a big culture shock, and I've been lucky enough to, enjoy all the good things in sport, but also probably seen some things which might be considered integrity issues. And being on this committee and being a part of sports integrity, I'm just keen to, share those experiences and hopefully shape education and the message the right way so that, in the future we can win the smart way, the safe way and, the right way.
Because you were involved in gymnastics beforehand, and we'll know that there has been, following Athlete A, there's been a lot said about gymnastics and hopefully things have changed for the better.
Yeah, I think it's early days. Like, over the years, there's been a lot of coaches coming from, different backgrounds, different cultures, and they've been brought into Australia to, get the results a certain way and the way that they're familiar with. I think a lot of that is education, and I think that's a big part of it. And I think now that it's, coming to light, unfortunately, it's taken so long and it's taken documentaries like Athlete A, like you mentioned, for people to shed a light on this and realise that actually this is probably not okay. We need to do something about it. But it's moving in the right direction. Sports Integrity is getting involved. They're building a framework around member protection, child safety, and I think if we keep moving in that direction, we'll sort of see a sport that's a lot healthier, happier, and athletes with the longevity that we want.
Why did you decide to join the Athlete Advisory Group?
Like I said, being involved in the sport, and similar to Bronwen, sport is a big part of my identity. I've been doing the sport for over 20 years, and I want to give it back and seeing and experienced some of these things that probably could have been avoided through education. I just hopefully the experience that I have and the perspective that I bring from a gymnastics background can help shape things in a way that helps move the sport in the right direction.
Do you feel as though you can make a contribution in terms of forcing change? And I guess you've talked there about education. It's important that athletes and coaches, when they're educated, understand the message.
Yeah, I hopefully get some change. Like Bronwen said, it's early days. We've just sort of stepped into the role where we're still learning and understanding the big scope that sport integrity look after. It is bigger. There's a lot of different areas and the categories that really specifically I feel are directly related to trampolining is the member protection and the child safety. I did the sport since I was 10, 11. I went from a club background to a state program to a national program. I've experienced it from all different levels and I feel like I've got a perspective and understanding that these are the sort of issues that happen at each of those different levels, and maybe there's a story or two that I can share that will, just start a light bulb moment and be like, actually, that's interesting. Maybe we can apply those learnings and fix things in the right way.
Did you have much education when you were coming through?
No. In terms of an athlete, you get in there, you got a job to do, you do what your coach tells you, and at the end of the day, you're sort of focused on, got your blinkers on getting the results, and you do what it takes to get there. So sometimes that's going about in the right way, and sometimes it's not the right way. So I think a lot of it's education of a coaching level or a staff or an organisation, so that as a kid you might not be willing to speak up or be aware that
I guess understanding too of what's right and wrong, and when you can speak up and getting that confidence to speak up.
It is a confidence thing, and sometimes in sports you're in a position where confidence is lacking. You've got a figure that's in a powerful position, and sometimes that can be manipulated if it's sort of the education's lacking. So as an athlete, once you get older and you build that confidence and you build that relationship, you're more willing to speak up or notice things that are not okay, and maybe you can share those stories. But it's really important that for gymnastics, it's got such a large base of athletes that are young. Gymnasts starting from 5, 6 years old. A lot of athletes under the age of 18. So it's important that the coaches, the staff, anyone involved in the sport and those athletes are sort of aware of the framework and the policies that are accepted and implement that.
And Bronwen, some of the stuff that I guess Blake's talking about there, does that resonate with you?
It does. And what particularly just landed for me then is that idea of confidence to speak up. And for me, I think it's more than just saying we need to help athletes be confident to speak up, because we're in very complex systems in sport, and whether it's real or perceived, often athletes don't feel comfortable to speak up because they feel like it might impinge on their capacity to be selected, or they might be deselected. So I think yes, it resonates, but I think part of the solution is enabling and educating coaches, officials, people working with NSOs to enable, so that there's an invitation of input and there's an invitation of feedback. It's not just the role of the athlete to be more confident in that very high pressure environment. We need to think about policies and structures that allow the system to tolerate feedback, and that it invites it, so that athletes are supported to say, in Blake's case, hey, that didn't feel right. Who can I go to? I know exactly who to go to, and the response from that person is a productive and timely response.
Because there is a power differential, isn't there? And sometimes, you mentioned a moment ago, Blake, you listen to everything the coach says and you follow those instructions.
Yeah, no, 100%. I agree. Having a platform where you can give that feedback and it's taken on board and there's actions, I think that's the biggest thing that I think is I'm starting to see change within the sport. I'm still involved. I'm not competing anymore, but I'm involved on the SMC, which is the Sports Management Committee in South Australia. So just sort of seeing sport from the other side now is interesting, and understanding why things weren't maybe actioned before or what areas were lacking. So it's hopefully we see progress.
And Jonathan, introducing you into the conversation as a para-triathlete, you bring a totally different perspective to the athlete advisory group, don't you? Because you've had quite unique experiences, I would imagine, as a para-athlete.
I have. I mean, a lot of what's been said already resonates as an elite athlete. Para-athletes are elite athletes as well. We train just as hard and compete all over the world. I think the different perspectives that we bring, I think Bronwen was talking to lived experience earlier, and that's something that the majority of the organisations and the athletes that are in sport in Australia and around the world don't have lived experience with disability, and a lot of those policies and decisions that are made that govern these sports don't always take into account people with disability because they don't have that lived experience. And so people like myself and Ellie Cole and other elite para athletes are sitting on these committees and these advisory groups because we need to have more of a voice to represent those athletes with disabilities to ensure that they're heard as well and their perspectives are seen. That's why I sit on a few different committees at the moment.
Because you're on the World Triathlon Athlete Committee as well, aren't you?
Yeah, that's I think 3 terms now I've sat on that one. That's predominantly able-bodied, but there's been up to 3 para-athletes on that committee as well. But we all sit on the same committee. NSWIS Athlete Advisory Group, I've been there for a couple of terms. I'm chair of the Triathlon Australia Athlete Committee and now on the Sport Integrity Australia Athlete Advisory Group. So I have my finger in a few different pies, but that's just because I think...
You've got enough time to train, or you?
Yeah. Still make time for that, that's for sure. But it's just having being able to share the perspective of people with disabilities and to educate and to have a voice in different areas. Like, with sport integrity, education is a huge piece. Even my own experiences recently with accessing sport integrity modules that we have to do as part of being elite athletes, there's some accessibility issues within that. So picking up on things like that others might not. And with where parasport is at the moment, it's evolving very, very fast. And some of the integrity issues that we face are very different to what the able-bodied community face in that. There's a lot of young athletes coming in now. There's this big boom of young athletes and they all need to be educated. There's classification is a huge one as well. That's a very rapidly evolving space around disability and minimum eligibility to compete in parasports. And even things like there's very few parasports that have prize money, and where there's money in sport, you tend to find there's things like match fixing and doping and all these things because the price to win is higher. Whereas in parasports, there's very few sports. I think wheelchair tennis is probably one of the only ones that actually earn prize money in international sport. So, but that's changing. There are sports that are starting to include prize money. Even now in Australia, after the Tokyo Games, we all know the story around medalists, Paralympic medalists not receiving any reimbursement or prize money for winning medals until Tokyo. So even things like that, that's starting to change. And then I feel we're going to see more things like, people in those communities that are involved in match fixing and things like that will start to come in and potentially have an influence down the track. So I think because it is increasing in prize money and sponsorship and all these things. So I think that's a space we need to get ahead of the game, basically. Do
you think that able-bodied sports could learn a lot from parasports? Is that what you're hoping to impart as well?
I say yes, but
Well, I guess what I noticed, for instance, at the Paralympics and having commentated at Paralympics in the past, it is a totally different feel than the Olympic Games themselves, in that there is so much goodwill towards each other. And I thought, well, gee, the Olympic Games themselves could learn a lot from the way that para-athletes conduct themselves, for instance. It doesn't seem to be that win-at-all-cost mentality.
Yeah, and I think any minority group out there would have that sense of community, and that's what people with disabilities have. We're all part of a community, and you see that in the Paralympic movement as well, whether it's within Australia or internationally, we're all there to support each other because we're trying to grow this movement and get equality, basically. That's what we're fighting for. So whether it's in general life or whether it's in sport and getting prize money and getting equal funding from your sport, all these sorts of things. So, there's a lot that can be learned. I know the Australian Paralympic team in Tokyo was recently awarded the number one Australian team.
Our favourite team, yes.
Yeah, favourite team voted by all of the Australian community. So that shows a lot, and that came a lot down to Channel 7's coverage, and fortunately we're in the same time zone, so we could actually see a lot of what was happening over there in Tokyo, and I think that highlights a lot of what we're about. Yeah.
You make it a very good point there. In a lot of athletes are coming through. The profile, for instance, of Paralympians is at an all-time high, as judged by the people of Australia. The coverage was fantastic on Channel 7 from Tokyo. But right across the board, there are so many young athletes coming into the sport. I'll just whip it around. Did you see it as a problem, Bronwen, in that, we've just got to really have a strategy to make sure that everybody is educated and has an understanding of some of the integrity issues in sport, because we're seeing an influx of people involved in a range of sports. We've got 2032 Olympic Games just around the corner, really.
And isn't that going to be a boon for sport in Australia? So there's always going to be young people coming in, and wonderful that there's that role modelling and visibility that Jonathan was talking about. That's encouraging people to pursue sport at elite level. Education is such a big part, and it's about how we do that education, how it actually gets to the right people, how all those young people coming in access education. Whose responsibility is it to see that they get that education? Is it the coach? Is it the NSO? Is it sport integrity? Do they need to do it themselves? So there's so many complexities there. It's such a big task, because there's thousands of people wanting to get on that elite pathway. I think something that I'm interested in is Blake mentioned it earlier, that sort of win at all costs mentality. And you see it starting so young. So I'm a mum now, no longer an athlete, but I have one of my kids is, in under-9 soccer. And even in under-9 soccer level, there's, selections, there's travel for sport, and I look at it and I'm torn, because I think he loves it, he enjoys it. But on the sidelines, some of the coaches are pretty intense. There's realms of research that says early specialisation in sport doesn't necessarily produce a champion at the end, and yet we continue to do it. It's costly, emotionally and financially, and I wonder what is the answer there? How do we address that?
If I had an answer for you, I'd give it. But with gymnastics, the athlete participation base has been growing year after year, and I expect that to, like you said, skyrocket once we're heading towards Brisbane. Gymnastics is so broad. There's gymnastics for all, there's recreational gym, there's artistic men's, women's, rhythmic, trampolining, cheerleading. It's so big, and so having a large member base, it's important that a lot of those members are sort of at a younger age. They get in there young. They, during early years, 4, 5, 6, they're learning those foundational gymnastics skills. Parents take them to daycare, they drop them off at gymnastics. So I think without really knowing an answer to the problem, I think it is, establishing that there is a culture issue, especially at that elite end, and that building that framework and that policy so that across the board, everyone's aware of what's expected, what sort of policies and what sort of culture gymnastics wants to push for. And I think they're moving in the right direction. So I'm excited for the future, really.
And Jonathan, we mentioned there a lot of young kids probably didn't think they could be Paralympians, and they've seen it on television and they want to be Paralympians now.
Yeah.
Do you receive enough education, do you think, in the Paralympic community?
Yes. Yeah. I just think that it does need to be made available at a younger age with para athletes, because there are less numbers of athletes with disabilities competing, and because we're seeing this big influx of athletes, most of them are young. You only have to look at the Australian Dolphins para-swimming team, and I would think majority of that team are teenagers still. They're all quite young, so I think education is a huge thing.
So just started earlier?
Yeah, to start it earlier, yeah. But, to what Bronwen was saying, I've got 2 young kids, and our eldest, Isaac, he started playing soccer, and it's really interesting when you see the parents and the coaches on the sideline and how intense they are. And I don't know if you've watched it, but King Richard and watching the Williams sisters and how they grew up and how they really highlighted that space around parents and how brutal they were with their kids and so much pressure they put on them. And you really do see that. It's hard to police, but I think the new sport integrity framework around that and calling that out is a place there for that to be looked at. But it's really amazing to see that, and I actually don't really understand how it gets to that. But there are a lot of pressures on kids, and if they do start going into that elite space, working their way up through the different levels, and that pressure, it seems to always be on them. So I think in the para space, it's not as much there, because quite often for us, it's about having a go, that I was saying, whereas
I think it's moved on from that a little bit.
It is, because there are pathways now. I mean, even in my own sport, it's a relatively new sport. We've only been in 2 Paralympics in terms of para-triathlon, and 2014 was when the high performance program kicked off, and it's evolved quite rapidly since then. And now we're seeing a lot of young kids in the development space coming, because there's room for that to happen and funding for that. So there are pathways, and as we said before, 2032 coming up, there's going to be a huge boost in funding, hopefully, across all sports to build over the next 10 years, because there will be kids that are 8 years old now. They're like, I want to come and play sport. I want to be in Brisbane. And that's going to see another boost in athletes coming in. So now's the time to get ahead of that evolution that's coming.
Just to wrap it up, I guess the key is to identify the threats, isn't it? And understand, not necessarily what's right or wrong, but the barriers and understanding, for instance, in the eyes of a coach, how far they can push an athlete, how far they can, go in terms of the way they speak to athletes. Athletes understand their rights as well. So it's important, I would imagine, that we really understand and identify the threats early when it comes to integrity.
100%. I think just having the right team, like sports integrity, getting us athletes together, and we're building a bit of a team and hopefully work together. I know gymnastics as an organisation is starting to do a bit of a refresh and building the right team. So I think just having the right people in the right positions so that things can get actioned and move forward, I think is really important.
Just a final comment from you, Ron?
I was just going to sort of follow on your comment, Tim, around barriers, and I think that's kind of a critical word there, because it's not really so much around what's right or wrong. I think fundamentally most athletes, most coaches, most systems kind of appreciate what's right or wrong, but it's about removing some of the barriers that enable us to find out if there is a problem and making that reporting. Things like reporting pathways simple, education really accessible to young kids as well, even to parents. They have an influence here as well. So yeah, I think that attention on the barriers is something that's quite important to the work that we'll be doing.
A couple of years ago, if we had a discussion like this here at Sport Integrity Australia, it would be all about supplements. We've really moved on, understanding there are wider issues, not just anti-doping, and I think it's important that everybody understands that it isn't just anti-doping. There's a lot of other factors at play now when it comes to integrity in sport.
Totally, and I think through visibility, things like Athlete A, there is a much bigger focus on athlete wellbeing and caring for individuals. Doping violations are happening; they're still happening, but there's a big focus on wellbeing, I think, which is a great step forward.
Yeah, and you saw that, I think, was it 2018? There was the 2030 policy, Sport Australia policy put out, and that had a huge focus on athlete wellbeing and engagement. And we saw athlete wellbeing engagement managers come into all the sports. And since then, we've seen that space grow and I think all the committees as well that a few of them that I've become part of have been since that time, because the athlete voice is now front and centre in a lot of issues. That's why it was, like you said before, it used to just be about supplements, but now there's all these other integrity issues that are coming through because athletes have a voice about those spaces.
Thanks very much for joining us today, Bronwen, Jonathan, and also Blake. It's been great to have a chat. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
And now for our segment From Left Field, where we answer a question from the public.
Hi, my name's Annabelle and I'm a Sport Integrity Australia athlete educator. The question I have from left of field today is there a minimum age for testing and being banned from sport? The answer is no, there is no minimum age for being tested. However, Sport Integrity Australia has testing processes to support athletes who are under 18 years. For example, minors can ask to have a parent or authorised representative such as a coach present with them during the testing process. This can help to make sure that the athlete feels comfortable during the testing process, especially if it's their first time. It is important to remember that all athletes, regardless of their age or the level they compete at, are subject to the same anti-doping rules and penalties. Ultimately, athletes are responsible for what they put into their bodies, even if they are a minor. However, if there are other contributing factors to a rule violation committed by a minor, such as the influence of a coach or parent, that will be taken into consideration when deciding the length of the sanction.
Thanks for listening to Onside. I'm Tim Gavel, and we'll be back with another episode of Onside shortly.
You've been listening to Onside, the official podcast of Sport Integrity Australia. Send in your podcast questions or suggestions to media@sportintegrity.gov.au. For more information on Sport Integrity Australia, please visit our website www.sportintegrity.gov.au or check out our Clean Sport app.